Black Waitress sheltered a freezing billionaire CEO. Next morning, 500 SUVs stopped outside her diner. Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's dive into this incredible story. It was a cold, harsh winter night in New Orleans, the kind where the streets shimmered with ice and the air felt like a slap to the face. The wind howled through the alleyways as Naomi Carter locked up the Bayou Spoon, the small diner she worked at, just as the clock hit midnight. A storm was brewing, the kind that made the world feel silent, like it was holding its breath. Naomi hadn't planned on staying out too late, but when she went to check the outside of the diner one last time, she saw him. A man, soaked to the bone, stumbling toward her door. His designer suit was torn, his face pale, and he looked like he was struggling to stay on his feet. Naomi quickly opened the door, her instincts kicking in. She'd seen the worst of what life had to offer, but this was different. This man wasn't just anyone. She could tell by the way he walked, the expensive shoes, the expensive watch. He was someone powerful, and he was in trouble. Naomi rushed to his side, helping him inside. She didn't ask questions, she just moved quickly, her hands steady despite the storm raging outside. She guided him into the diner's back room, away from the cold, and laid him down on a booth, wrapping him in a spare blanket she kept for late nights. His breathing was shallow, labored, and Naomi could see the bruises on his face. He had been in a fight, maybe more than one. "Please don't let them find me," he whispered weakly, his eyes fluttering. Naomi didn't know who they were, but in that moment, she didn't need to. All she knew was that this man was in danger, and if there was one thing she knew how to do, it was take care of people who needed it. As the wind howled outside, Naomi kept an eye on him, her mind racing with possibilities. Who was he? Why was he running? And most importantly, who was he running from? The storm outside mirrored the chaos that seemed to be unfolding inside. Naomi didn't want to admit it, but she knew deep down that this wasn't just another night at the diner. Something had shifted. She'd taken in a stranger, a billionaire no less, and now the story was just beginning. Little did she know that this decision would change everything, not just for her, but for him as well. In the coming hours, Naomi would learn that saving a life often comes with unexpected consequences. Consequences that would start unfolding when the storm passed and the sun rose on a new day. But for now, Naomi stayed with him, her heart pounding, her mind working over the situation. What was coming next? The rain was relentless, hammering against the diner windows as Naomi stood by, watching over the unconscious man lying on the booth. She had placed a fresh towel over his forehead, but his condition wasn't improving. She could tell he wasn't just a regular customer. His clothes alone spoke of wealth, but it was his desperation, the way he begged her to keep him safe, that had kept her from turning him away. The storm raged outside, the wind howling like a wild animal, but inside, Naomi's mind was racing. She knew that people like him didn't end up in places like hers unless something serious was happening. And she could tell this wasn't just a random act of kindness. He was running from something, or someone, and she had no idea what kind of trouble she was about to step into. She had seen her fair share of desperate people in the diner, but nothing had ever felt quite like this. As the hours passed, and the storm didn't seem to let up, Naomi started to hear sounds outside the diner. The faint hum of engines, the distant sound of tires crunching against wet pavement. It was barely noticeable at first, but the closer it got, the more it unsettled her. She moved toward the window, peeking through the blinds, and saw what she feared. A fleet of dark SUVs, parked in a perfect line outside her diner. At first, she thought it was just another set of strangers passing through, but the sight of them parked out there, motionless, made her heart race. She knew they weren't just looking for shelter from the storm. Whoever they were here for the man she was hiding. Naomi stepped back from the window, her thoughts racing. She had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but she knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just some random coincidence. She turned back to the man on the booth. His breathing was still shallow, but he hadn't woken up. Naomi bit her lip, torn between staying with him and figuring out what to do about the group outside. But the decision was made for her when she heard the unmistakable sound of someone banging on the diner door. She rushed to the back and grabbed the phone, but there was no signal. Of course, in a storm like this, the last thing she could count on was getting help. The door slammed again. Naomi looked at the man, then back at the door. She had to act fast. She couldn't let these people inside. They'd find him, and who knew what they'd do to him, or to her. With no other option, Naomi grabbed the man by his shoulders, gently but firmly, and pulled him to his feet. He groaned in pain, but she kept moving, guiding him through the back door into the kitchen. She could hear the voices outside now, the footsteps getting closer. She had no choice but to hide him. If she was going to protect him, she needed to get him to safety. Naomi led the man down the hall to the pantry, pulling open a small closet door in the back. She gently shoved him inside and closed the door quietly, her heart pounding. She stood there for a moment, listening. The voices outside were getting louder, but they still hadn't come inside. She slowly walked back to the front of the diner, glancing through the blinds one more time. The SUVs were still parked outside, like an ominous presence waiting to pounce. She took a deep breath and steeled herself. This wasn't just about serving coffee or flipping pancakes anymore. She was in the middle of something much bigger, and she couldn't afford to back down. The next few minutes were crucial. With a shaking hand, Naomi walked to the front door and unlocked it. She swung it open, stepping out into the storm. The rain was still coming down in sheets, but she barely felt it as she approached the group standing by the SUVs. They were dressed in dark suits, their faces hidden under hoods or sunglasses, but their eyes were cold, calculating. Naomi stood her ground, not flinching as they approached. She couldn't let them know she was afraid, even if she was. "What do you want?" she asked, her voice steady despite the fear clawing at her chest. One of them stepped forward, a man with a sharp jawline and a cold smile. "We're looking for someone," he said, his voice smooth but dangerous. "We think he's hiding inside. You've seen him, haven't you?" Naomi didn't say a word. She knew exactly who he meant. This was the moment of truth. She had a choice to make. If she gave them any information, they would find him, and that would be the end of it. But if she didn't, if she lied, she might be putting herself in even more danger. She took a deep breath and looked him straight in the eye. "I haven't seen anyone," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. The man narrowed his eyes, his gaze piercing. He didn't believe her, but he didn't press her further. Instead, he nodded to his companions. "Keep an eye on the place," he said. "We'll be back." With that, they turned and walked away, disappearing into the storm. Naomi stood there for a long moment, her heart still racing, before she finally let out the breath she'd been holding. She had bought herself some time. But for how long? The night stretched on, the storm still raging outside, but inside the Bayou Spoon, it was eerily quiet. Naomi had just locked the door behind the group of SUVs and the mysterious men who had come looking for the billionaire. She stood by the counter, her heart still pounding from the tense moment she had just endured. The man she was protecting was still hidden in the pantry, though she wasn't sure how much longer she could keep him there. It was only a matter of time before they returned, and Naomi knew she couldn't keep lying to them forever. She had made the decision to protect him, but now, the reality of her choice was sinking in. She turned around and looked toward the back of the diner where the man was still lying, barely conscious. He had been through something, she could tell. His clothes were torn, and his face was battered with bruises. He wasn't just any ordinary man. He was someone who had power, someone who was being hunted, and someone who had now become her responsibility. Naomi walked back to the pantry, her footsteps echoing in the otherwise silent diner. She gently knocked on the door, her hand trembling just a little as she turned the knob. The man stirred when she entered. His eyes opened, still blurry with pain, but his gaze immediately locked onto hers. "What happened?" Naomi asked softly. The man tried to sit up, but his body was too weak. He winced in pain as he propped himself up against the wall. "They're after me," he muttered. "I can't go back." Naomi didn't know what he meant by they, but she didn't press him further. The situation was bad enough without adding questions that didn't have answers. "You're safe here, for now," Naomi said, trying to reassure him, though she didn't feel reassured herself. The man looked at her with a mix of gratitude and fear. "I can't stay here long," he said, his voice weak. Naomi nodded, glancing over her shoulder at the door. "I know. But we can't just run. They're watching the diner now. I saw them. The men in the SUVs. They won't stop until they find you. The man took a deep breath, his eyes closing for a moment as if gathering his strength. Naomi could see the conflict in his eyes. He was clearly used to being in control, used to making decisions, but now he was vulnerable, trapped in a diner with nowhere to run. I don't know what to do, Naomi said quietly, more to herself than to him. We need to think this through. The man looked at her then, his expression softening. You've helped me. I owe you. I'll make sure you're taken care of. Naomi shook her head. I didn't do this for any kind of reward. I just did what I thought was right. She could feel the weight of the decision on her shoulders. She had no idea who these people were or what they wanted, but she knew she couldn't let them hurt this man. She had already made a choice, and now she had to live with it. The silence between them stretched on, broken only by the sound of the storm outside. Naomi didn't know how long they could stay hidden, but she knew it wouldn't be long before the situation got worse. The man on the floor, still weak but trying to stand, met her gaze. What's your name? He asked. Naomi hesitated for a moment, but then she answered. Naomi. Thank you, Naomi, the man said, his voice filled with gratitude. Naomi nodded, not sure what else to say. There was a knock on the diner's front door, and her heart skipped a beat. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. It was too soon. It couldn't be them. She hurried toward the door, heart racing, unsure if she should open it. But as she neared, she realized it wasn't the men from the SUVs. It was the sound of a delivery truck pulling up outside. Naomi let out a sigh of relief, but she knew this brief moment of peace wouldn't last long. She looked back at the man still sitting in the pantry. We need to figure something out. They'll be back. And when they do, we have to be ready. She wasn't sure how she would protect him, but one thing was certain. She wouldn't let them take him without a fight. The man nodded, looking grim. I don't want to drag you into this, he said, his voice low. But I have no choice. I need help. Naomi knew then that her life was about to change forever. She had already made the decision to protect him, but now she had to make sure she could see it through. The next few hours would determine everything, and Naomi had no idea what kind of danger she was really in. All she knew was that she couldn't back down. Naomi stood by the window, her eyes scanning the empty street, heart still pounding from the unexpected knock earlier. The delivery truck had been a false alarm, but she knew the danger wasn't over. The man she was protecting, the billionaire CEO, was still hidden in the pantry, and the storm outside wasn't the only thing raging. She could feel the tension building in the diner, thick and suffocating. She glanced over her shoulder at the man, who had been silent for the past hour, recovering from his injuries but clearly still shaken. Naomi had never expected to find herself in this kind of situation. Helping a stranger wasn't new to her. She had spent her whole life looking out for others, putting herself last to make sure people around her were safe. But this was different. This man, this billionaire, wasn't just anyone. He had power, influence, and most likely, enemies who would stop at nothing to find him. She walked to the pantry door, knocking softly before entering. He looked up at her, his face a mixture of exhaustion and gratitude. Thank you, he said, his voice rough from pain. You've done more for me than anyone else would have. Naomi nodded, though she didn't feel like it was much. She had no choice but to help him. We're not out of the woods yet, she said quietly. They'll come back, and when they do, we need to be ready. He nodded, his brow furrowing as if he was trying to process everything. Who are they? Naomi asked. She had been wondering that since he first stumbled into her diner. Why are they after you? The man hesitated for a moment, his eyes shifting away. Naomi wasn't sure if it was the pain from his injuries or something else, but she could tell he wasn't ready to tell her everything. I'll explain everything later, he said, his voice low. But right now, we need to focus on getting out of here. Naomi frowned. Getting out of here? You're not going anywhere until you're better. He shook his head, his hand reaching for the edge of the table for support as he tried to stand. I can't afford to wait. They'll be back soon, and if they find me here, they'll tear this place apart. Naomi stepped forward, placing a hand on his shoulder to steady him. We'll figure something out, she said, though doubt crept into her voice. She had no plan, no backup, and no real understanding of what was happening. But Naomi had never been one to back down when someone needed help. Just rest for now. I'll keep watch. She moved toward the window again, but before she could get there, A loud bang sounded at the diner's back door. Her heart skipped a beat as she looked back at the man, panic flashing across his face. "They're here," he whispered. Naomi rushed to the door, peeking through the blinds to see two dark figures standing in the alley, their eyes scanning the diner. She quickly backed away, heart racing. "What do we do?" The man's voice was urgent, a hint of fear that hadn't been there before. Naomi took a deep breath, trying to steady her nerves. "Stay here," she said, her voice firm. "I'll go out there and distract them. You need to stay hidden." The man's eyes widened. "No, Naomi, don't do that. They'll find you too." She shook her head. "I can't just sit here and wait for them to break in." The thought of being caught, of being dragged into something she didn't understand, terrified her. But what terrified her more was the idea of leaving the man to face these men alone. Naomi didn't wait for him to protest. She grabbed the spare keys from behind the counter and stepped toward the back door, her mind racing. She didn't know if she was making the right choice, but it felt like she didn't have a choice at all. As she opened the door, she was met by the cold, wet air, the storm still in full force. The figures outside hadn't noticed her yet, and she used that moment to slip into the alley, her heart pounding in her chest. She crept behind the dumpster, her hands shaking, but she kept moving, determined to buy the man more time. She glanced back toward the diner, praying he was still hidden. Naomi had no idea how long she had before they realized she wasn't in the diner. But she knew one thing. She had to keep them away, keep them from finding the man who had already become her responsibility. She heard the soft crunch of footsteps on wet pavement as the figures began to move closer to the back of the diner. Naomi swallowed hard, her mind going blank for a moment. She couldn't let them catch her. She couldn't let them find him. And for the first time in her life, Naomi realized she was in way over her head. But there was no turning back now. She straightened up, taking a deep breath before stepping out from behind the dumpster, her face set with determination. This wasn't just about a diner anymore. This was about survival. Naomi stepped out from behind the dumpster, her heart pounding as she moved into the rain-soaked alley. The storm was still furious, wind howling, the rain pouring in sheets, but she could feel her pulse racing, her mind focused on the task at hand. She didn't have much time before the men realized she was gone, and she knew she needed to get their attention, distract them, anything to keep them from finding the man she was protecting. The footsteps grew louder, closer. She couldn't see them yet, but she knew they were coming. Naomi moved swiftly, her feet slipping on the wet pavement as she darted between two parked cars, trying to stay out of sight. She couldn't afford to be noticed. She had no plan, no backup. This was it. As the figures drew near, she took a deep breath, steadying herself. She wasn't just going to stand there and let them catch her. She had to be smart about this. She looked around, eyes scanning the alley for anything she could use. Her gaze fell on an old trash bin, half empty, its contents scattered on the ground, and something caught her eye. A broken broomstick. It wasn't much, but in her hands, it might be enough. Naomi grabbed it quickly, holding it tight, the wet wood cold against her palms. She moved into position, leaning against the brick wall, hidden from view. Her heart was beating louder than the storm now, but she fought to control it. She took another deep breath, waiting. The figures were almost on her. She could hear their low voices, muffled by the rain. They were talking, but she couldn't make out the words. They stopped just a few feet away from her. Naomi gripped the broomstick tighter, her knuckles white, but she didn't move. The sound of their boots sloshing in the rain was the only thing she could hear. She waited, counting the seconds in her head. When the first man stepped forward, Naomi struck. With a swift motion, she swung the broomstick toward the man, catching him across the chest. He stumbled back, surprised, but not hurt. Naomi didn't give him time to recover. She rushed forward, pushing him back into the other man who had been too close behind. The two men collided, falling to the ground with a loud crash. Naomi's adrenaline was surging, her movements fast and wild, but she knew she couldn't keep this up forever. She needed to create more distance. She backed away quickly, eyes scanning the alley for her next move. The men weren't getting up as quickly as she expected, giving her a brief window of opportunity. She darted toward the entrance to a nearby building, her breath coming fast, her body still shaking from the rush of energy. She wasn't sure if they would follow her or if they would regroup. But she knew one thing for sure. She had bought herself time, and that's all she needed. Naomi didn't stop to look back as she ran into the building, closing the door behind her as quietly as she could. She leaned against it, catching her breath, listening for any sign that the men were following. The rain and wind drowned out most sounds, but she wasn't about to take any chances. She needed to get back to the diner. The man she was protecting, the billionaire CEO, was still there, hidden in the pantry. But Naomi had no idea how much longer she could keep this up. She knew the men would be back, and when they came, they would be looking for him, no matter what it took. She had to get him out of there, fast. She checked her phone, but there was still no signal. The storm had knocked out the cell towers, leaving her with no way to call for help. Naomi's mind raced as she thought of options, but there was nothing that felt like a good plan. She couldn't just run and leave the diner behind. She had no idea where she could take the man, no safe place to hide him. And even if she did, how long would it be before those men found them again? She didn't have the answers. All she had was determination. She couldn't afford to think about failure. The storm had passed, but the danger hadn't. Naomi knew the clock was ticking. Every minute counted, and she needed to act now. She took one last look around the building, then slipped back into the alley, moving with more caution this time. She wasn't sure what was waiting for her outside, but she had no choice. She had to keep moving. Naomi's breath caught in her throat as she turned the corner of the alley and saw them. The two men who had followed her were standing at the far end, their eyes scanning the street. But they didn't see her yet. Naomi took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the broomstick again. She had to do this. She had to buy them more time. Naomi stepped forward, but this time, she was ready for whatever came next. Naomi stood frozen for a moment as the two men at the end of the alley turned and began walking in her direction. Her heart pounded loudly in her chest, her grip tightening around the broomstick she had been using to fend them off earlier. She had no intention of letting them catch her off guard this time. They were close, too close for comfort. Naomi quickly stepped back, blending into the shadows of the alley, praying they wouldn't spot her. The rain had finally let up, but the streetlights cast a harsh, cold light, making it difficult to remain unseen. The men were still scanning the area, but Naomi knew their eyes weren't looking for her. They were looking for the man who had sought refuge in her diner, the one she had promised to protect. She could hear their footsteps coming closer, each step echoing in her ears, louder and louder, until it felt like they were right beside her. Naomi barely dared to breathe, staying as still as possible, her mind racing through every possible scenario. She knew she couldn't outrun them. She couldn't outfight them, either. But she had something they didn't have, determination. As the men passed, Naomi made her move. She darted across the alley, her footsteps light but swift, toward the back door of the diner. She didn't look back, her eyes focused on the door, the only escape route she had left. She had to get inside, get to the man, and get him out of there before they found him. The door creaked as she opened it, but she was quick, slipping inside and closing it quietly behind her. Naomi rushed through the diner, her heart still racing, but she was no longer afraid. She had a job to do, and she wasn't about to let anyone take away her chance to protect the man who had come to her for help. She found him in the pantry, sitting up now, his eyes clearer but still wary. He looked up at her with a mixture of concern and gratitude, but Naomi didn't have time to talk. "We need to move," she said urgently, her voice low but firm. "They're looking for you. We can't stay here much longer." The man nodded, trying to stand, but his legs were unsteady. Naomi rushed to his side, helping him up. "We can't just walk out of here," he said, his voice hoarse. "If they're outside, we need to be smart about this." Naomi nodded, her mind already working, formulating a plan. She didn't have many options, but she couldn't afford to wait for them to find her. She glanced toward the back window of the diner. It was too risky to go out the front, especially with the two men out there. But if she could get to the back alley, they might have a chance of escaping unnoticed. She motioned for him to follow her, keeping her movements quick but quiet. "I'll go first," she whispered. "Wait for my signal." She moved toward the back door again, peering through the window. The two men were no longer in sight, but Naomi knew better than to assume they were gone. They were still out there, waiting for any sign of movement. Naomi took a deep breath, her heart racing as she opened the door just a crack, enough to slip through. She waited, listening intently for any sound, any indication that they were close. It felt like hours, but it was only seconds before she motioned for the man to follow. He stepped out behind her, his footfalls soft but quick, his breathing labored. Naomi didn't stop to look back as she led him through the alley, each step echoing in the night air. She could feel the weight of the danger surrounding them, but she couldn't stop now. She had made her decision. She had chosen to protect him, and she would see it through to the end, no matter what it cost her. They reached the end of the alley, and Naomi paused, peeking around the corner. The coast seemed clear, but she knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. They had to keep moving. Naomi turned to the man, her voice barely above a whisper. "We need to get to my car. It's just a few blocks away." The man nodded, his face pale but determined. Naomi took his arm, guiding him carefully through the streets, staying in the shadows, keeping a low profile. They passed a few people, but no one seemed to notice them. Naomi was thankful for the cover of night. They reached her car after what felt like an eternity, but the danger was far from over. As Naomi fumbled with the keys, she felt a chill run down her spine. Something was off. She could hear the faint sound of engines in the distance, growing louder with each passing second. It was them. The men had found them. Naomi didn't hesitate. She jumped into the car, starting the engine as quickly as she could. The man climbed into the passenger seat, his eyes wide with fear. "Drive," he said, his voice shaking. Naomi didn't need any more encouragement. She hit the gas, the car roaring to life as they sped off into the night, leaving the danger behind, at least for now. As they drove through the quiet streets, Naomi's mind raced. She didn't know where they were going, but she knew one thing for sure. She was in deeper than she had ever been before, and there was no turning back now. Naomi's hands were shaking as she gripped the steering wheel, the car speeding down the empty streets. Her mind was racing. She had managed to get away from the two men outside the diner, but now they were being pursued, and the weight of the situation was becoming overwhelming. The man beside her, the billionaire CEO, was silent, his face pale and tense as he glanced nervously out the window. Naomi could feel the tension building in the car, the uncertainty hanging in the air between them. "Where are we going?" he asked, breaking the silence. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't planned this far ahead. She didn't have a safe house, no backup, and no one she could trust. But she knew she couldn't drive aimlessly forever. "I don't know yet," she replied, her voice steady but low. "But I'll figure something out. We just need to keep moving." She glanced at him quickly, seeing the uncertainty in his eyes. "They'll find us if we stop." The man nodded, understanding the gravity of the situation. Naomi could tell he wanted to ask more questions, but he didn't, and she was grateful. She didn't have the answers he was looking for, and she didn't want to lie to him. She had already put herself in danger by helping him, and now she had no idea how she was going to get him to safety. Naomi's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, the headlights of a car cutting through the night behind them. The unmistakable silhouette of an SUV was visible in the reflection, and her stomach dropped. They were following them. She couldn't see how many there were, but she knew it was only a matter of time before they caught up. She pushed the gas pedal harder, the car speeding faster down the road, the tires screeching against the wet pavement. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still slick, and Naomi's grip on the wheel tightened as she navigated the turns. She had to lose them. She couldn't let them get any closer. "They're behind us," the man said, his voice tight with anxiety. Naomi didn't respond. She focused on the road ahead, her heart thudding in her chest. Every minute, every second counted. She needed a plan, and fast. As she rounded another corner, she spotted an old, abandoned warehouse up ahead. It wasn't much, but it was a place to hide, and right now, that was all she needed. "Hold on," Naomi said, her voice sharper now. She swerved the car into the parking lot of the warehouse, the tires sliding as she fought to keep control of the vehicle. She quickly parked behind a row of large dumpsters, keeping the car out of view of the street. She turned off the engine and sat still for a moment, listening. The sound of the SUV's engine roared past them, not slowing down. Naomi's heart pounded in her chest, but for the first time in what felt like hours, she allowed herself to exhale. "We lost them," she whispered, her voice filled with relief. The man beside her sat back in his seat, his shoulders slumping slightly. He was still tense, but Naomi could see the weight of the fear starting to lift from his face. "That was too close," he said, his voice hoarse. Naomi nodded, still gripping the steering wheel. She had no idea how long they would be safe here, but she knew they couldn't stay too long. "We need to figure out what to do next," she said, her voice firm again. "This is only temporary. They'll be back, and when they come, we need to be ready." The man looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you," he said quietly. Naomi didn't answer right away. She was too focused on the next move, on what to do to keep them both safe. "You don't owe me anything," she replied finally. "I'm just doing what I think is right." She opened the car door and stepped out, her shoes splashing against the puddles on the ground as she walked toward the warehouse. The man followed her, still limping slightly from his injuries. Naomi moved quickly, her mind working on overdrive. She had to think of something, some way to get them out of here, to safety. She couldn't keep him hidden in this rundown warehouse for long. It wasn't safe. She glanced around, scanning the area for any signs of life. The warehouse was empty, the windows covered with grime, the door rusted and half open. It was dark inside, but Naomi didn't hesitate as she pulled the door open wider. They both stepped inside, and Naomi closed it behind them with a soft click. The inside of the warehouse was cold, the air heavy with the smell of mildew and old wood. Naomi's eyes adjusted to the dim light, and she found herself surrounded by empty crates and old machinery. It wasn't much, but it would have to do for now. "We'll stay here for the night," Naomi said, her voice steady. "Tomorrow, we figure out the next step. We can't stay here forever." The man nodded again, but Naomi could see the worry in his eyes. He wasn't used to being in a situation like this, no one was. But Naomi had been through her own share of hardship. She knew how to survive. She had to survive, and she would do whatever it took to make sure they both made it through this alive. Naomi stood at the entrance of the warehouse, her back pressed against the cold, rusted door. The dim light from the cracks in the walls barely illuminated the room, but it was enough for her to make out the shape of the man who had followed her inside. His face was still tense, the fear lingering in his eyes despite the brief respite they'd found. Naomi let out a slow breath, trying to calm her racing heart. She'd just narrowly avoided capture, and now they were here, in this rundown warehouse, with no real plan of escape. It felt like a temporary fix, but it was all she had for now. She couldn't afford to stay hidden for too long. She could feel the pressure of the situation building, the weight of uncertainty pressing down on her. The man took a step closer, his limp more noticeable now that they had slowed down. Naomi could tell he was exhausted, but she didn't have time to feel sorry for him. They both needed to focus on getting out of this mess, and fast. "We can't stay here," Naomi said, breaking the silence. Her voice was steady, but the urgency in her words was clear. "They'll come looking for us. It's only a matter of time before they track us down." The man nodded, his eyes dark with concern. "I know. I just need a moment to think." Naomi's gaze shifted to the crates scattered around them. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even here, in the darkness of the warehouse. "Think fast," she said, her voice tight. "We don't have much time." She moved to the back of the warehouse, her eyes scanning the area for anything that could help them. There had to be a way out, but she couldn't afford to take unnecessary risks. Every decision they made had to count. The man slowly followed her, his steps faltering slightly as he tried to keep up. Naomi could hear his labored breathing, but she didn't stop. She couldn't afford to slow down. They reached a small window at the far end of the warehouse, and Naomi knelt to look out. The street was empty, but the SUV they had seen earlier was still parked nearby, and Naomi's stomach twisted with fear. "They're out there," the man said from behind her. "They'll be back." Naomi clenched her fists, frustration rising inside her. She had to do something, anything, to keep them safe. "I know," she whispered. "We need to make a move before it's too late." As Naomi stood up, a sudden noise made her freeze. Footsteps, faint but unmistakable, echoed in the distance. She turned toward the man, her eyes wide with alarm. "They're coming." The man's expression shifted, the fear returning in full force. "What do we do?" Naomi didn't hesitate. "We need to leave now." She moved toward the back door, but as she reached for the handle, a loud bang from outside made her jump. "We're running out of time," she muttered under her breath. She yanked the door open and looked out into the alley. There were no signs of the men, but Naomi wasn't about to take any chances. She grabbed the man's arm and pulled him with her, moving quickly and quietly through the alleyway. They had to make it to her car. Naomi had no idea how far ahead they were, but she was certain they would be able to outrun the danger. They had a small window of opportunity. The rain had stopped, but the streets were still wet, the sound of their footsteps muffled against the slick pavement. Naomi's eyes were constantly darting around, checking for any signs of movement. She wasn't sure if they were being followed, but she couldn't let her guard down. Every corner they turned made her more anxious. She reached for the car keys in her pocket, her hands trembling with the weight of what they were running from. Just as she reached the end of the alley, she looked up and saw her car parked a few feet away. The headlights blinked in the distance, but Naomi's relief was short-lived. There, standing next to her car, were two men, their faces obscured by dark hoods. Naomi froze. She had no choice but to act fast. She turned to the man, her breath coming in short gasps. "Get in the car," she ordered, her voice firm. Without waiting for him to respond, Naomi darted toward the men, the broomstick she had grabbed earlier in her hand. They hadn't noticed her yet. She wasn't going to let them catch her off guard again. As she got closer, one of the men turned, spotting her in the dim light. "What the hell are you doing here?" he snarled. Naomi didn't answer. She swung the broomstick with all her might, catching the man square in the chest. He stumbled back, but she didn't wait for him to recover. She moved quickly, driving the end of the broomstick into his stomach, forcing him to the ground. The other man lunged at her, but Naomi was faster. She stepped to the side, using her foot to kick him off balance, sending him sprawling to the wet pavement. Naomi didn't wait to see if they got back up. She rushed toward the car, her hands shaking but her mind focused. The man was already inside, and Naomi quickly jumped into the driver's seat, slamming the door shut. "Go," the man said, his voice low and urgent. Naomi didn't hesitate. She started the car and hit the gas, the tires screeching as they sped off into the night. The danger wasn't over, but for now, they were safe. Naomi's heart was still pounding, but she allowed herself a small breath of relief. They had made it out for now. The road ahead was uncertain, but Naomi was determined. She had made a promise, and she was going to keep it. Naomi's hands were still shaking as she drove through the quiet streets, her mind racing with everything that had happened. The events of the past few hours felt like a blur, a whirlwind of fear, uncertainty, and adrenaline. But now, with the man beside her, they had finally escaped the immediate danger. They weren't safe yet, but they had time, a brief moment to breathe. Naomi glanced over at the man in the passenger seat. His face was pale, but his eyes were clear now, and there was something about him, something she couldn't quite place, that made her wonder who he really was. He hadn't told her much about himself, and she hadn't pressed him. She had done what she felt was right. She had helped him when no one else would. She didn't know what would happen next, but for the first time in what felt like forever, she didn't feel as alone. "Are you all right?" Naomi asked, her voice soft. The man nodded slowly, glancing out the window as they passed through the streets of the city. "I'm fine," he said, his voice low but steady. "You've done more than enough." Naomi didn't respond immediately. She was still processing everything, the close calls, the fear, the danger they had narrowly escaped. She didn't know how much longer they could stay ahead of the people after him, but for now, all she could do was keep moving. She focused on the road, her eyes scanning every turn, every street they passed. She had to stay sharp. She couldn't let her guard down. After a few minutes of tense silence, the man spoke again. "You know, I don't think I ever really thanked you," he said, his tone serious. Naomi glanced at him, surprised by the sudden shift in his voice. "I'm not looking for thanks," she said, her eyes back on the road. "I just did what anyone would have done." "Not everyone would have," he replied, his voice quiet but firm. "You didn't have to help me, but you did. I can't forget that." Naomi didn't say anything. She wasn't used to receiving gratitude. She had always been the one giving it, the one helping. It felt strange, but somehow comforting. She nodded, not sure how to respond. A few more minutes passed in silence, the car moving steadily through the streets. Naomi's thoughts kept drifting back to the man she had brought with her, to the mystery of who he was and why he was in so much danger. He wasn't a regular customer, that much was clear. She had known from the moment he stumbled into her diner that his problems ran deeper than just a bad night. She had helped him because it felt right. But now that they were here, now that they were in the car together, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to his story. "I should have told you earlier," the man said, breaking her thoughts. I'm Richard Langston, CEO of Langston Technologies. Naomi's heart skipped a beat. Langston Technologies. She had heard of the company, one of the largest tech firms in the country, a powerhouse. It was hard to miss in the news. Langston Technologies, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Richard nodded, his face grim. Yeah, he said, looking out the window again. I didn't expect things to spiral like this. Naomi didn't know what to say. She had no idea what to think. She had been helping a billionaire CEO this whole time, a man who was worth billions of dollars. She had no idea what kind of enemies he had. But now, the weight of the situation was hitting her hard. What happened? She finally asked, her voice hesitant. Richard hesitated for a moment before speaking again. It's complicated, he said, his tone dark. There are people who want to bring me down. People who don't care about what happens to anyone caught in the middle. Naomi didn't ask him to elaborate. She didn't need to know the details. She didn't care about his business or his enemies. What mattered was that she had helped him, and now, they had to figure out what to do next. They couldn't stay on the run forever. They needed a plan. Naomi thought for a moment, then turned to Richard. Where can we go? She asked. We can't just keep driving around. We need a place to lay low. Richard turned to her, his eyes meeting hers. I know someone who can help, he said. But it's risky. We'll have to trust them. Naomi nodded. At this point, I don't think we have a choice. Richard gave a small nod, his face still serious. All right, he said. I'll make the call. He pulled out his phone, his fingers moving quickly over the screen as he dialed a number. Naomi focused on the road again, the hum of the car and the quiet ringing of Richard's call filling the air. She didn't know what they were walking into, but she had no choice but to trust him. They had made it this far together, and Naomi wasn't about to turn back now. The city lights flickered as they drove on, the weight of everything still hanging over them. But for the first time in a long while, Naomi allowed herself to feel something else, hope. It was faint, but it was there. They had survived this far, and as long as they kept moving, they might just have a chance to make it out of this alive. In this gripping black story, Naomi, a waitress, finds herself thrust into a dangerous world when she helps a freezing billionaire CEO who is being hunted by powerful enemies. As she navigates the perilous journey to protect him, Naomi becomes entangled in a web of deceit and danger that threatens both their lives. As the two go on the run, Naomi discovers that this black story is not just about survival, but also about loyalty, trust, and the unexpected bonds that form in the most unlikely of situations. Throughout their escape, Naomi is faced with difficult choices, balancing the risks of helping a stranger with the need to stay alive. With enemies closing in and time running out, Naomi must rely on her instincts and resourcefulness to protect the man who has unwittingly put her life in danger. This black story will leave you on the edge of your seat as Naomi and the billionaire CEO fight to stay one step ahead of those who wish to destroy them. Will they survive, or will the forces chasing them catch up? The story unfolds with high tension, twists, and a glimpse into a world where trust and betrayal go hand in hand, making it a must-watch for anyone who loves thrilling black stories filled with suspense and action. As the stakes rise, Naomi and the CEO learn that sometimes the most unexpected allies can make all the difference. Don't miss this intense black story that proves courage and resilience can shine through even in the darkest of times.